Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Stephen Shalowitz. First, reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. Well, to learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribed, rated, and reviewed us. 5 stars, of course. Wherever you get your podcast, it's so easy. And we'd love it too if you shared the show within your universe. And by the way, in just a moment, I'll be telling you why you need to be in Dallas, Texas. I'm going to be there from November 14th to the 17th, 2024. So it's just around the corner. So do listen out for that. But first, on this episode, we welcome back Matti Friedman, award-winning journalist and author, and one of the most insightful people I know. We welcome him back for his third visit on IsraelCast. Born in Toronto and based in Jerusalem, his work has appeared regularly in the New York Times, the Atlantic Tablet, and so many other outlets. His most recent book, which we talked about on his last visit here to IsraelCast, is Who by Fire? Leonard Cohen and the Sinai. It tells the story of the singer performing for Israeli troops during the Yom Kippur War. Matti's book, Spies of No Country, Secret Lives at the Birth of Israel, won the 2019 Natan Prize. His work, Pumpkin Flowers, A Soldier Story of a Forgotten War, was chosen in 2016 as a New York Times notable book and one of Amazon's 10 best books of the year. His first book, The Aleppo Codes, won the 2014 Sami Rohr Prize and the ALA Sophie Brady Medal. Matti lectures widely and is one busy guy, so we are grateful that he's carved out the time to join us here on IsraelCast via Zoom from his Jerusalem home. Matti, welcome back to the program. Always great to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, listen, there's a lot to cover. And, when I first interviewed you, that was in September of 2019, which we were talking about before we started rolling. So already it's 5 years ago. You highlighted that this quote unquote, is not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but something larger and regional. And that assessment, as we see, is really playing out right now. So I'd really like us to start there. And if you can shed some light on that for our dear listeners.
Sure. I think we were speaking not long after I published an op-ed making that point in the New York Times when I was still writing for the op-ed section of the New York Times, shortly before the paper kind of conclusively plummeted over the edge of sanity. But the argument that I made there was that although this conflict is covered by Western press organizations as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if you try to understand it in those terms, you won't be able to make sense of what's going on here, because a news story works best if it has two actors, if possible, a good guy and a bad guy. And that's why the story is set up in that way, similar to Russia, Ukraine, or Democrats versus Republicans, with the good guy and the bad guy, depending on what kind of media you're consuming in the latter story. But that's what makes a news story really tick. And it doesn't really work if you have a story that's too complicated. And what you have in the case of Israel is a regional conflict with maybe a dozen different actors. Israel's unfortunately had to fight wars against countries like Syria and Jordan and Egypt and Iraq. And Israel has fought, of course, in Lebanon. And Israel's most important regional antagonist for the past 30 years or so has been Iran. But none of those actors are Palestinian. And yet the conflict is set up as if it were an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when in fact Israelis and Palestinians are unfortunately in conflict, but those are just two actors who are part of a much more complicated regional picture. And if you start understanding it like that, by zooming out, looking at the region and trying to fit together the different pieces, you'll actually be able to make sense of Israeli decisions. And if you insist that the only two actors are Israelis and Palestinians, nothing that Israel does will make any sense. And I think that's really been illustrated pretty clearly over the past year, or even just in the past few weeks. Right? We've been hit just in the past few weeks with rockets from Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, Gaza, and of course, Iran. So it doesn't really make sense to pretend that this conflict is Israeli-Palestinian. And that's one of the key ways that this story is fictionalized for Western audiences, and it causes quite a bit of misunderstanding.
And give the context or the analogy of World War II, if you would, what we talked about before we started rolling.
Sure, I gave an example in that op-ed, which I've heard quoted back at me quite a bit, which is that we don't talk about a U.S.-Italy war in 1944. Yeah, you've never heard of the America-Italy War of 1944, even though American GIs were dying in Italy. We don't call it the America-Italy War because it's World War II, of course. And if you don't understand that it's a world war, and if you don't understand actors like Japan, of course, brings America into the war, and if you don't understand the Soviet Union and Britain and Germany, and if you don't understand any of that, then it makes no sense that the U.S. Army is fighting in Italy. And Americans just get that instinctively. We know that there is no America-Italy war, and that it doesn't make sense to call for an America-Italy peace agreement because that's not the war. It's a small section of a much broader regional war. And I'm not saying this is exactly analogous, but it's a useful thought exercise in understanding that this is one small part of a much broader regional conflict. If you look at a map of the Middle East, you'll see that there are conflicts raging here from North Africa, Algeria, going east, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and as far east as you want to go, maybe Afghanistan. And Israel's one very small part of that regional picture. Israel's 1/5 of 1% of the landmass of the Arab world. 0.2%. So obviously, this is a very small place that's caught up in something much bigger. And one reason that Western observers often find it very hard to understand what's going on here is that they insist on seeing this country in isolation when it simply cannot be understood through that lens.
And I wanted to highlight that again. We shared that in our very first interview from September 2019, but we're in such a moment right now that it really, really is worth repeating. However, one wants to define a world war, I think we are in a world war, and I'm just wondering if you can weigh in on that.
Certainly, from here, it looks like a regional war with the increasing involvement of global powers. I mean, we have, of course, America, and we have the Russians engaged increasingly on the side of Israel's enemies, the Iranian side. We have the Chinese, who seem to have taken over the past year a much more pronounced stand against Israel, which is perceived as an American ally. So you have elements here of a global conflict, although what we're experiencing is very much a regional conflict inside the Islamic Middle East. So I'm not sure that I would call it a world war yet, but it's certainly a global war with many actors, and it's quite an explosive situation that could well bring in bigger global powers if it's not being handled right. And I'm not sure that it is, to be honest, in part because the superpower upon which we depend and many other actors in the Middle East depend is preoccupied. I'm talking about the United States, of course, preoccupied with its own internal political breakdown. And in the vacuum of American power and influence over the past couple of years, over the past decade, maybe over the past 15 years or so, other actors have moved to fill the vacuum, and those players are bad for Israel, and I would argue that they're also bad for America, primarily the Iranians, but they're not the only ones. So yes, there are definitely global elements to this story, but in any case, if you're just pretending that this is a story about Israeli settlers and Palestinian olive farmers in the West Bank, you won't be able to understand anything that's going on. And I'm not saying that that's not an element of the story. It is. And I have my own opinions about it as someone from the left side of the Israeli political spectrum, but that is one piece of a much bigger story. And it can only be understood if you zoom out and look at the whole region.
Sure. I mean, because when you have the Chinese supporting the Iranians, which of course are behind Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, et cetera, that's where it gets tangled, if you will. Um, I want to ask about the media because you certainly have journalistic bona fides, having worked for the AP, worked within the media landscape. And when you see the stories that are coming out about Israel, about the IDF, about or stories that aren't coming out about the hostages, for example, what goes through your mind, Matti?
I think I'm someone who isn't that surprised by what's happened over the
Mm,
past year. And that's only because I experienced it firsthand when I was a reporter for the AP between 2006 and the very end of 2011. I was a reporter and an editor on the Jerusalem desk of the Associated Press. The AP is the world's biggest news organization, at least according to the AP. It's the American news agency, so it's a very big player in the news world. And I worked for the office here in Israel, and I went in, I think, quite naive about press coverage and came out very cynical about it. And what I saw and what I subsequently described in two essays that I wrote about this in 2014 was that a big part of the news industry, not everyone, but a big part of the news industry had moved from explanatory journalism to political activism. And the people making decisions in our bureau were primarily interested in activism and not in explaining what was going on. The activism was coming largely from the world of the hard left, which has a strange sympathy for radical Islam. And the Israel story was being presented in those terms. And I saw it at the time. I was quite surprised by it. Again, being someone of liberal sympathies, I didn't come in primed to hate the press or anything like that. And I wrote about it in 2014. So by the time this, and I've written about it since then. So by the time this war happens, I kind of know what's going to happen. And what we've seen over the past year has been, of course, a much more extreme expression of what I saw at a relatively early stage of the evolution of this phenomenon. But it's fundamentally the same thing. And I think many people have realized that in the past year, not just regarding Israel, but I think many people have realized that what we used to call the mainstream press has been, to a large extent, taken over by political activists who are using press coverage as a weapon in a political war against their opponents. And one of their opponents, unfortunately, is the state of Israel, which they view as almost an embodiment of the evils of the modern world: colonialism, racism, nationalism, militarism. And the roots of this are complicated and we can get into it, but they certainly see the country in that way. And because so many of the press organizations have kind of fallen victim to this political ideology, then it gives that ideology the means of mass replication, because millions of people read what is essentially a political fantasy, but don't know that it is, because they're 8,000 miles away from Israel and have no idea what's actually going on here. And we've seen the same virus take over large parts of the academic world, and we've seen it take over the human rights world. So you have a kind of alliance of hard left activists who now operate what used to be the mainstream press, what used to be the human rights world, and what used to be the academy. And one of their prime targets is the state of Israel. But it's not the only target. And I think many people, going into this American election, find themselves just kind of bewildered by what has happened, unable to navigate the blizzard of bad information that they're getting from formerly reputable news sources. You're getting propaganda from the right and propaganda from the left. And the old days when people would just kind of turn on the evening news and believe what they heard, those days are behind us. And it's a big part of the confusion and the anger that people feel at this dark moment in Western civilization.
And then you add social media to the mix, and that's a whole other ballgame, isn't it?
Absolutely. Social media has been a major disruptor, both in terms of the information that you get on social media, but also because social media has completely disrupted the financial model of the mainstream press. So as soon as Facebook comes online, which is actually when I'm at the AP, but again, between 2006 and the very end of 2011, which is precisely the years when social media really hits. And suddenly those advertising dollars that used to go to the New York Times or used to go to the Washington Post start going to Facebook or other platforms, and the bottom just falls out of the industry, and there's no longer money to pay experienced reporters. And it's not the only reason for the move toward activism, but it certainly doesn't help things. So you have social media really killing the mainstream press and subjecting people to this blizzard of disinformation. But I think also surrendering the role that the mainstream press could have in an environment where people are bombarded with bad information. So you have a social media world where you're just being hit with all kinds of stuff all the time. Most of it's complete nonsense. And what should happen is that people should be able to turn to the New York Times or to the Washington Post or to the AP and know that they're getting good information. And in fact, there's an opportunity there for what used to be the mainstream press to be the alternative to social media, because I think people want to get some kind of solid information that they can trust, and they should be getting it from the brands that people used to trust. And instead, those same brands have adopted an activist function and have joined the circus of disinformation rather than being the antidote to it.
I'm so glad you brought up academia, because I wanted to ask you if you can just provide perspective on the demonstrations that you saw unfold on college campuses, both in the last academic year, but now we're seeing them once again, and everything that's playing out on the streets of London and New York and you name it, whichever city around the world.
Yeah, I think I'm here in Jerusalem, so I'm not sure that I'm the best commentator on
But certainly you're
the
seeing them in the news. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. But in part because I'm always skeptical of people describing this place from afar. I'm always hesitant to describe other places from here. But I think with caution, I can say that what we're seeing is a very scary moment for not just for Jews in the West, but for the West in general. We're seeing mass protests essentially in favor of Hamas in cities, including the one where I'm from, Toronto, not a place that you'd really expect to see political radicalism of this kind, but we're seeing mass marches in London. And of course, we've seen, the scenes that we saw on campus during the last academic year. And I think it seems to still be going on. So clearly what we're seeing here is quite a broad social movement. I don't think, billions of people are necessarily involved in it, but certainly millions of people are across the liberal West. And I think that's something that Hamas understood when they embarked on this adventure on October 7th. They understood in a way that I think Israel didn't, and I think many Jewish people didn't, that they have a lot of allies in the West. That if they can launch a horrific terror attack against Israel, which involves, you don't need me to spell it out, but it involved not just mass murder, but kidnapping of innocent civilians, children, rape, you name it. They understood that many people in the West would actually be happy to see this and would come out in support of it, not just, rabble on the street, but professors from Ivy League universities. And if you were in the ideological environment of the academy or the press or the NGO world 10, 15 years ago, you knew this was coming. But I think for many people, it was quite a surprise, and people still expected the universities to be bastions of liberal values, and they're not really anymore. It's not that there are no voices saying the right thing on campuses, but the dominant voice seems to be something very different, and it's very scary. The institutions which always served as the pillars of the liberal West, not always, I guess, since the Second World War, certainly in the period that I really grew up in, which was the 1990s, they seemed like unassailable pillars of liberalism. And I think Jewish people really depended on those pillars and wanted to be part of them, right? People wanted to be in the academy, they wanted to be reporters, they wanted to be in the government, and they saw rightly those institutions as guardians of civil rights, not just for Jewish people, but for everyone. And it's been quite scary to see those same institutions transformed into something completely different over the past 20 years, hollowed out by activists and repurposed. And one of the targets has been Israel. So I think that that's what we're seeing. We're seeing this idea that the evil of our time is racism. And although you might think that conclusion would lead you to be concerned with the welfare of Jews, who of course have been targets of racism, what's actually happened is that Jews and the Jewish state have been held up as almost the most perfect incarnation of racism, the cause that must be fought by everyone concerned with injustice in the world. And you have these really astonishing coalitions of fundamentalist Muslims, queers for Palestine, Ivy League professors, African-American activists. You have this alliance that you would think would not agree on very much, but they do agree that the worst country in the world is the Jewish one. So you've seen Israel used as a very effective means of mobilization for a social movement that isn't necessarily really concerned with the state called Israel. Of course, they know nothing about it, but they've seized upon this as a symbol of everything that they hate. And of course, for Jews, this is a familiar instinct. Jews often become the symbol of what people hate at a given time. And it's happened again in countries where I think Jewish people were not expecting it to happen.
Right. I want to pivot and talk about UNRWA. And indeed, we could probably do a whole episode on the UN organization. I mean, you had the Hamas data center located right under UNRWA's Gaza headquarters. You had all the Hamasniks that were hiding in schools, those that were working in schools, that were principals of schools, and on. I mean, just the list goes on. Like I said, we can do just a whole episode on it. And just recently, as we record this, Israel has now approved a law, in the words of the Times of Israel, quote, barring UNRWA from operating in Israeli territory and in favor of another measure curtailing UNRWA's activities in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank by banning state authorities from having any contact with the agency. And I'm just wondering, Matti, from your perspective, why now? And then what's next for UNRWA? Because, I mean, I know that Hillel Neuer, who heads up UN Watch, who I think deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, by the way, I mean, the work that he does is absolutely phenomenal. This exposure of UNRWA has been known for years already, in far before October 7th.
It is a good question. What took so long? And there have been critics of UNRWA for many, many, many years. And of course, Hillel Neuer, my fellow Canadian, is one of them, and Einat Wilf is another one. Einat Wilf wrote a really excellent book with Adi Schwartz about UNRWA and about the the Palestinian refugee question. UNRWA is created ostensibly to deal with the displacement of Palestinians during the War of Independence in 1948, when you have about 720,000 Palestinian refugees. And instead of functioning like the agency that was formed at the same time to deal with refugees from the Korean War, in the case of that agency, in a few years, they've basically wrapped up their treatment of the refugee problem, resettled whoever they could, and ceased operations. No other refugee population in the world has the ability to pass on refugee status indefinitely through the generations. So you have a situation where 720,000 or so refugees become more than 5 million refugees today, even though the vast majority of those people have never been to this country and aren't refugees judged by the standards of any other conflict except for this one. And there are additional questions about UNRWA, which we've really seen illustrated over the past year when we've seen UNRWA staff participate in terror attacks. And we've seen Hamas embedded in the UNRWA infrastructure and UNRWA, in UNRWA schools and across the Gaza Strip. And Israel has always been hesitant to touch UNRWA because UNRWA, I think the Israeli authorities think that UNRWA helps keep things quiet by distributing aid, by providing social services that, were they not in the hands of the UN, would have to be taken care of by Israel. So Israel's always had an interest in keeping the lid on by allowing UNRWA's activities. And that's why it has operated until now. And only in the past year, like many other concepts that collapsed, this one did too. And I think the Israeli authorities realized that UNRWA might give Israel some short-term gains, but in a long term, it's perpetuating the conflict, magnifying the conflict, and allowing, in a very practical way, allowing terrorists to operate under its auspices and to attack Israel. And it's become untenable. And that's why you saw that vote in Knesset, which passed with a very large majority, which is rare in Israel these days. Everything, is a matter of, great political infighting and usually passes on the strength of half a vote or something like that. But here you had a very broad majority because Israelis have figured this out. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction in the international community, including from the United States, which has this idea that this agency is necessary and needs to be reformed, maybe, but needs to be left in place. But I think that's incorrect. Aid needs to reach Palestinians, certainly, and it can be done through other channels. It can be done through many other UN agencies. It can be done through USAID. You can think of many other ways of delivering
UNHCR, for example.
UNHCR deals with all other refugee populations. Yeah. And the Palestinians have their own separate refugee agency with its own criteria for refugee status, which doesn't really make any sense. So, of course, there are many other alternatives. It's a matter of willpower. And I'm not sure if we're going to see international will, but at least Israel has come to a clear conclusion about UNRWA. And again, speaking as someone who's not a supporter of the current government of Israel, and I think we have a terrible government, maybe the worst government in the state's history. We can talk about that if you want, but I think on this, the government is absolutely right. And I was happy to see the opposition vote with the government on this matter.
We're not going to talk about that, Matti, because we don't get into politics here on the program. But the reason why I brought up UNHCR is that that's one organization that can fulfill the need of some of the things that UNRWA has been doing, or the World Food Program, or UNICEF, or USAID. I mean, so there are other organizations, and it doesn't have to be UNRWA, which is a highly, highly corrupt organization. So then just staying with the United Nations, there's UNIFIL, right? And so I would love you to talk about that, because it seems to me that they failed so miserably and seemingly went unchecked for all of these years. And what's the story behind that?
Yeah, the list of United Nations failures could preoccupy us for the rest of the podcast. We'll just go agency by agency, but
plus a few other episodes beyond that.
Certainly,
yes.
That's a better conversation, I think, to have with Hillel Neuer, and he knows a lot about it. But
we've got to get him on the program. I have to tell you, I've been wanting to get him on the program forever, but I know that he's so crazy busy, and I never know when I should reach out and when he'll be available. And I almost don't want to bother him, because I'm like, you go, Hillel. You know what I mean? Even just to take an hour of his time when he can be really advocating. So that guy, again, he deserves like a Nobel Peace Prize in my book.
I would try him. He's Canadian, so he might be too polite to say no.
Oh, good.
UNIFIL is formed many decades ago as a peacekeeping force in South Lebanon, and it's bolstered after the 2006 Israel-Hezbollah war. Israel withdraws from Lebanon after that war under an agreement that sees UNIFIL expand its forces in South Lebanon. UNIFIL is supposed to prevent the arming of Hezbollah south of the Litani River, which means adjacent to the Israeli border. And it's supposed to provide a kind of a security or a secure area north of Israel's border and prevent Hezbollah attacks. And UNIFIL has been an abject failure. And there are questions about whether they just, whether they're just feckless and don't do their job, or whether parts of UNIFIL are actually corrupt and collaborating with Hezbollah. But in any case, Hezbollah has very effectively rearmed, as we saw in South Lebanon. They've been able to fire upwards of 9,000 rockets into Israel beginning on October 8th. UNIFIL did nothing to stop it. Not only did they do nothing to stop the actual rocket fire, they did nothing in the 17 years leading up to October 7th to prevent the arming of Hezbollah. Once the Israeli army moved into South Lebanon with a ground operation that's been happening over the past couple months, Israel finds that there are there's an incredible tunnel network under the villages in South Lebanon. Hezbollah has been stockpiling weapons. Hezbollah was preparing an October 7th style attack into Israel that would have been several orders of magnitude greater than the Hamas attack out of Gaza. And this is all being done under the noses of UNIFIL. And UNIFIL is very quiet about all of that. But as soon as Israel acts to remove the threat from the border, UNIFIL gets very agitated about Israel harming UNIFIL forces. And the whole thing's been really a disaster, I think, for the reputation of international bodies and the use of international forces as a way of solving conflicts. Because what this means is that Israel cannot rely on an international force to provide security on the northern border. And that has forced Israel into this operation. That means that if UNIFIL had done its job, this war in the north would not have been necessary. So we're seeing that Israeli lives are being lost, which is devastating for us. And people from my neighborhood have been killed over the past week, and reservists, people with kids, teachers, people have been killed in Lebanon fighting this war. And of course, there's devastation in South Lebanon. Israel's had to go into these villages and blow up the Hezbollah infrastructure, which is often built under people's houses. So the citizens or civilian residents of South Lebanon are also paying a very steep price for the failure of this UN force to do what it was supposed to do. And I think that it really should, as in the case of UNRWA, it really needs to lead us to ask questions about the efficacy of international bodies. What is the United Nations? Who does it really serve? And I think many people in the West would like to have a kind of naive faith in the United Nations as an international body that, is basically positive and does what it can and sends peacekeepers. And as an Israeli, that's not been our experience at all. We've seen the UN and arms of the UN turned into more or less active collaborators with our enemies. And I think that's true of both of the bodies that you mentioned, the one in Gaza and the one in Lebanon. These facts have ramifications for what we're going to see here in the future.
Yeah, and as we talk about Hezbollah and all the rockets, let's not forget that 60,000 plus Israelis have had to evacuate from the north.
Right. My parents live in Nahariya, which is the northernmost town on the coast that hasn't been evacuated. And if you go north of Nahariya, then you're in a swath of Israel that's been completely emptied of civilians. It's very eerie. I wrote a story about it for the Free Press, which is where I write these days, and came out about a month ago, and it just describes this kind of ghostly part of northern Israel where you walk around towns and there's no one there. And yeah, between 60 and 70,000 people have had to evacuate their homes for a year, beginning with the Hezbollah attack on October 8th. And that's not a situation that Israel can live with. Now you're seeing a lot of very strange responses from observers in Lebanon. They can't figure out why Israel is attacking villages in South Lebanon. They're kind of up in arms about an Israeli response. Israel's been begging for the past year for some kind of solution to the problem on the northern border that wouldn't require a war. And Lebanon is such an ineffective state that they can't even control their own territory or make their own decisions about war and peace. And it's a tragedy for Lebanon. I mean, certainly it's a tragedy for Israel, but it's also a tragedy for Lebanon, which is a country that I have very warm feelings for. And I wish the people there had better lives than the lives that Hezbollah has engineered for them.
Indeed. How do you think, Matti, the war has changed Israeli society and the Israeli psyche?
Yeah, I think it will take us years to analyze the changes that this war has wrought. I mean, certainly we've seen something about our neighbors that many of us didn't want to see. Many Israelis, I think, held on to some faith that a political solution would be possible here. I think people didn't want to believe in the level of barbarism that our neighbors were capable of enacting.
Mhm.
And we saw it on October 7th, and you really can't unsee it once you've seen it. And of course, the people who suffered the brunt of the attack on October 7th are some of the most left-wing Israelis. And that's part of the story for people here, people who live in the kibbutzim on the Gaza border, are very dovish and have always sought some kind of coexistence with uh, Arabs in Israel and the residents of Gaza who live close to their homes. And those people were brutally murdered and raped and kidnapped on October 7th. So anyone who thinks that 1990s style solutions are still going to be possible here going forward, a two-state solution, some kind of negotiated compromise with the Palestinians, none of this is happening. And the next generation, I think it's very important to know that. And the political left here is essentially defunct, and that's tragic for someone like me who identifies with that part of the political spectrum. But I think we have to understand that these ideas in Israel 2024 are seen as not just as naive, but as very, very dangerous. We let our guard down and paid the most horrendous price possible. I think that you're seeing an awareness that our military system is unworkable in terms of how we bring manpower into the military, and that's really playing out right now. I mean, I have friends who have been called up for their third stint of reserve duty. So people who are, parents, they have jobs, and they've been, they were in Gaza for months and then in Gaza again for months, and now they're fighting in the north, or they're back in Gaza and Jabalia, and people who are not only not at home, but are risking their lives, and in some cases not coming back to their homes. And at the same time, there's a broad swath of the Jewish population of Israel that doesn't serve. And I'm referring to the ultra Orthodox who are in the current government of Israel. So you have a very sticky situation where the government running this war, maybe the darkest moment in the country's history, it rests on the votes of ultra Orthodox parties who demand a draft exemption for their voters. And that is really coming to a boiling point here in Israel. And I don't think we're going to go back to a situation where you see Israelis really willing to accept the fact that ultra Orthodox men are not drafted into the military while our boys are called up, 3 or 4 times in the space of a year. So I think that's also changing. I think this is going to have an impact on relations between Jews and Arabs inside Israel. The impact might not be negative. I think there's actually an opportunity here to bring our Arab citizens closer. And if you look at polling information, you'll see that many Arab Israelis feel closer to Israel than they did a year ago. And that's interesting and not at all what you'd expect. But I think that a creative Israeli government, which is not the kind that we have, would see this as an opportunity to bring the 1/5 of Israelis who are Arab Muslims closer to the Israeli mainstream, offer them lives of safety and prosperity. And that could also be done. So we're at a moment of crisis, which is really an unprecedented moment of crisis, but a moment of crisis is also elastic, and many things could change. And I think you'll see many things change as soon as the war is over. In some ways it'll be for the better, and in some ways probably not. And of course, I'm hoping that most of the changes will be positive.
Matti, what are some of those underpinnings why the Arab community feels that way?
I haven't done a deep dive into this, and all I know is from random conversations with people and looking at polling information. But I think Arab Israelis, to a very large extent, are aware more than Jewish Israelis of the other options in the Middle East. If you consume Arabic language media, and if you have cousins who live in the West Bank, and cousins who live in Lebanon, and cousins who live in Syria, then you know that the option that Israel offers is not perfect by any means, but better than all other regional options. And I think that in some ways our Arab citizens are more aware of that even than we are. And I think there's an opportunity there. And again, the opportunity is being missed because we have a government that is not primed for creative thinking. It's not primed for conciliatory policy. It really includes hardline voices of extremism, voices of kind of racial exclusion, and none of that is going to be productive if we want to create a unified society. But I think that there is an elastic moment. As I said, there's a fluid moment in Israeli society that could be harnessed by a better government and used to engineer a unified Israeli society. It's not going to be everyone, but it could be 70, 80% of the society that agrees on most things and decides to take the country in a constructive direction. That will require a change in leadership. And eventually there will be an election, and then we'll see the kind of energy that's bubbling under the surface, some of it negative and some of it positive. We'll see it expressed at the ballot box, and with some luck, we'll see a better Israeli leadership. It's not going to be the left-wing leadership of my dreams, but it could be a constructive leadership that sees this not just as a moment of crisis, but as a moment of opportunity.
I want to put a pin in the conversation around what's next after the war is over. And before we get to that and a couple other topics, I just want to share with our listeners that I hope they have a pen and paper handy. See, I'm very old fashioned when it comes to those things because I want them to jot down on their calendar. See, I even use a paper calendar myself. November 14th to the 17th to be in Dallas, Texas for Jewish National Fund USA's Global Conference for Israel. That's where Matti and I, by the way, first met, was in where was it? It was in Washington, D.C. that we met,
Right?
and it was in September of 2019. And I knew that Matti was there, and we had like an hour before I think you had to rush off to the airport, and I had to rush off to the airport. And we had a conversation that was totally unplanned, but it was the most fascinating conversation. And so I hope certainly listeners will check out that conversation. And I hope they check out all the conversations and everything else that will be going on at Jewish National Fund USA's Global Conference for Israel, once again in Dallas, Texas, November 14th to the 17th. It's a conference filled with solidarity, inspiration, tactical and practical solutions to standing up against Jew hatred and in support of Israel, and to learn how to be a voice for Israel. So I want each of you to go online and register if you haven't done so already. Go to jnf.org, and then you will see the link there for the conference, jnf.org. There's some phenomenal speakers there, including Colonel Richard Kemp, actor and comedian Michael Rappaport, Rabbi David Wolpe, and so many others. I'm going to be actually leading and moderating a panel on the media, so I'm really looking forward to that conversation as well. So I hope to see everybody that is listening right now in Dallas, Texas, November 14th to the 17th. I've never been to Dallas, by the way, so I'm looking forward to visiting that city indeed. I have been to Fort Worth, though. Have you been to either, Matti, by the way?
I have. I have. I was disappointed to find that people don't necessarily wear cowboy boots or cowboy hats or have anything to do with cattle. People seem pretty normal in Dallas. So if you're hoping for something really exotic and Texan, don't get your hopes up.
But I have to say, when I was in Fort Worth, I did notice people in the whole sort of cowboy gear. So maybe it's a
Maybe I
Fort
was
Worth thing. Maybe it's a Fort
maybe I
Worth
was
thing and
hanging out
not
in
a
the wrong
Dallas.
right. I might have been hanging out in the wrong part of town.
Absolutely. So you got to go back. Anyway, well, I look forward to seeing everybody there. All right, it's back to our conversation with Matti. You mentioned and you referenced neighbors, quote unquote, just a moment ago. And I just want to highlight just for a sec that this, of course, 2024 marks the 30th anniversary of normalization of relations between Jordan and Israel. In what role then do you think that Jordan has played that has been positive, or dare I say negative, over the last year and then moving forward? And is it a case of if they haven't done anything or done anything enough, it's more or less that they're afraid of their own existence and their own internal politics?
I remember the signing of the Jordan-Israel peace agreement, and I remember that hopeful time in the 90s when it really seemed that things were moving toward regional reconciliation. And there were maps published in Israeli newspapers at the time showing the routes that Israelis were going to take to get to Damascus. We were going to go shopping in Damascus. We are going to go shopping in Baghdad. And the Jordan Peace Treaty was a big part of it. And in many ways, the peace treaty has done what it was supposed to do. The relationship is, not one of war. The border is quiet most of the time, although in the past 3 months or so, there have been 2 terror attacks that I can think of that came from Jordan. So it's not as quiet as it used to be, but it is generally quiet. And there are ties between the Israeli military and the Jordanians. And I think that's maybe, if we're realistic about what a Middle Eastern peace agreement looks like, that's more or less what we're going to get. It's what we have with the Egyptians. It's not the warm peace that we dreamed of. I think many of us in the 90s dreamed that we were going to see a real friendship between these countries, which after all have a lot in common and have a lot of common interests. And that hasn't really panned out. The hostility in the Arab world toward Israel and toward Jews is significant, and it doesn't go away because a piece of paper is signed by leaders. And certainly the events of the past year haven't helped. In fact, I think one of the goals of the war that Hamas launches on October 7th is to make sure that, warm ties do not develop. It seemed that Israel was about to have another breakthrough with Saudi Arabia. And of course, we've seen breakthroughs with countries in the Persian Gulf. And that that threatens the forces of extremism in this region. And I think that that was part of the thinking behind October 7th. So, the I don't want to see the glass half empty. It's great that we have a peace agreement with Jordan. It's certainly better than the alternative. Has the regime in Jordan been, you know, reasonable in the way it speaks about Israel? No. Has it been honest in the way that it describes its own interests to its own people? No. I think the Jordanians really play a double game where they employ this kind of very fiery rhetoric against Israel and at the same time cooperate with Israel, but they don't really have the courage to stand up and say, our alliance with Israel is a matter of national interest and, to really stand behind that. So instead, they kind of play a double game where they say one thing in English and another thing in Arabic. And we've seen the Queen of Jordan say outrageous things about Israel. And Israel kind of swallows it, I guess, because it's better than the alternative. So the peace agreement exists. I'm glad we have it. It's better that we have it than not have it. But in many ways, it's been disappointing. And it would be nice to see a Middle East moving more in the direction of the Abraham Accords and less in the direction of, fiery and antagonistic rhetoric directed at Israel as it faces what is, after all, an enemy that's common to Jordan and the state of Israel, which is the rise of the Iranians and the Iranian proxy alliance system, which includes Hezbollah and includes Hamas, which are hostile to Jordan as well as to Israel. So it would be nice to see people being more honest in the way they speak, but that might be a lot to expect in the Middle East.
I finally want to get to Iran right now. And of course, there was the Israeli response just recently to the Iranian attacks. I'm not asking what the response needed to be, but what was the calculus that they considered in making the response? And it and what calculus will they be looking at moving forward in terms of future responses?
I can't claim to have any window into the secret rooms where these decisions are made, but it was obviously decided that there would be a response that would be significant, but would try not to tip the Iranians into all out war. And there were clearly restrictions placed on Israel by the Americans who are not interested in causing too much harm to the Iranians, certainly not immediately before an election. So Israel tried to kind of walk between the raindrops with this attack. But according to what I know, the attack was very effective. I mean, it achieved everything that it set out to do. Iran's air defense system has been largely knocked out. Iran's missile production system has been seriously damaged. And Israel's hope is that it made it possible for the Iranians not to respond in a particularly belligerent way. We'll see if that works or doesn't work. But I think Israel's made clear that it can operate at will over Iran. The Israeli Air Force operates over Iran for several hours, and every single plane comes back safely. And at the moment, Israel's left Iran without significant air defenses. And the Iranian regime knows that Israel can strike more or less at will. And it's restricted by, maybe by American considerations or maybe by Israel's own strategic considerations, but it's not restricted by any tactical considerations. And that's very important. And I think it's really a strategic shift in the Middle East. I mean, what we've seen over the past couple of months is a real shift in the direction of this war, where Iran's local proxies, that's Hamas and Hezbollah primarily, have been defanged to a large extent, not completely. Of course, we're seeing rocket fire from Lebanon, and there's still combat in Lebanon, but it's not even close to the level of combat that we expected in Lebanon a year ago. And at the same time, we've seen Iran hit pretty hard. Again, not neutralized by any means, but hit pretty hard. And the assumption was always that if Israel attacked Iran directly, then Hezbollah would open up with a massive barrage of tens of thousands of rockets that would paralyze Israel. Hezbollah is no longer capable of doing that. So we've seen, a real success for Israel over the past few months against the Iranian alliance system. By no means a conclusive victory, but certainly we're much better off now than we were several months ago. And the attack in Iran really illustrated it.
Matti, I want to talk about the hostages. How does one navigate and negotiate at this point for their freedom? I mean, especially the fact that there's so many groups there that are holding hostages. So what's the starting point, do you think?
The hostages remain one of the most painful issues for people here. And I know or knew one of the hostages, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, the name that I think will be familiar to many listeners because he was an American citizen, parents from Chicago, wonderful people who, I think a lot of people have followed that story, and tragically he was executed by his captors and won't be coming home. And I think Israel sets out, on this war with the stated goal of bringing the hostages home and destroying Hamas. And it turns out that those two goals are in conflict with each other. And, you could have stopped the war at the beginning, basically surrendered to Hamas's demands, returned thousands of prisoners, and tried to get as many hostages home as possible. Or you could remove the threat that Hamas poses. And Israel chose to do the latter. And I think that is a defensible decision, but it has cost the lives of hostages. And we still have about 100 hostages held in Gaza. We don't know exactly how many of them are alive, but the estimate that I've heard is that several dozen are alive. And it's a terrible dilemma for Israeli decision makers. And I have my own views on it. My views are that we needed to be much more creative in the way we think about getting people home. If we need to pause the war to make a deal and then restart the war, it seems to me that there could have been a way to maybe not get everyone out, but get more people out. But but I don't envy our decision makers who have to sit in those rooms and make decisions of life and death. And I think that they've made the decision that Hamas cannot be allowed to exist at the end of this war, even if that costs the lives of hostages. And I think that our leaders have lacked the courage to say that explicitly to the Israeli public. And here we are. I mean, I don't think very many of us thought that we'd be a year into the war with 100 hostages still held in Gaza. And it's a sign that the war, however well it might seem to be going at the moment, has not achieved its goals and has, not only failed to protect Israeli citizens on October 7th, but has failed to bring them home, even though we've had a year to do it. So the existence of hostages in Gaza, like the rockets that are hitting Israel as we speak, more or less, rockets are hitting my parents' town. And all of this illustrates that we have had success in this war. I think we have the upper hand in this war. I think we're winning. But we have not been able to end this war successfully on our own terms.
But it will, won't it?
I think that Israel will prevail in this war. And I think that, that's happening. But if one of our goals was to return the hostages, then I think we have to admit that that goal has not been achieved and won't be achieved because many of the hostages are no longer alive.
Again, switching gears, we had you on 1 year ago to talk about the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War and lessons learned from that conflict. What are the biggest lessons at this point, do you think, that Israel has learned from this war, which, as I've mentioned on the program, some people are calling the Second War of Independence? Or is it too early to say really what those lessons are?
It's interesting. I think that one of the primary lessons that Israel learns from this war is the same lesson that it learned from the Yom Kippur War, which is really a depressing comment on how people learn. The war that we're in right now starts almost exactly on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. I mean, it starts 50 years and 1 day after the outbreak of the Yom Kippur War. And the lesson that Israelis take away from the Yom Kippur War is that we were caught off guard, that we drank our own Kool-Aid about how strong we were, that we ignored intelligence warnings, that we should have been much more careful. How could we have been surprised on two fronts, on Yom Kippur, 1973? And Israelis were literally talking about this the day before October 7th, because it was the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. And then a day later, the same thing happens. Israel believed its own myths about itself, and Israel was unprepared to meet an attack of this kind from Gaza, and were caught completely off guard. And whatever successes we've had since October 7th still don't, I think, balance the unbelievable failure of the Israeli military on October 7th. I mean, 3,000 terrorists rampaged through Israel for more than 24 hours. I spoke to one woman from a kibbutz called Kfar Aza who went into her safe room at 6:30 a.m. on Shabbat morning, October 7th, and was rescued by soldiers at lunchtime on Sunday. And this happened about an hour and a half from Tel Aviv driving. So, that failure, I think, is the primary image left from this war, which reminds us that we can't let our guard down. It reminds us that we live in a very tough neighborhood. And if we're weak, that's not going to be seen as an opening for reconciliation and peace. It's going to be seen as an opportunity for attack, and not just a military attack in the way that we saw in 1973 when the Syrians and Egyptians surprised Israel, but they attacked the Israeli army on the borders of Israel. This was a very different kind of attack. This was an attack that plays out to a large extent in people's kitchens where, parents are murdered in front of their children. So this really has traumatized Israel. It's, I think, brutalized Israel to a large extent. It's made Israel very cynical about not just about our immediate neighbors, but about uh, the world in general, and including many of the countries that we see as our allies, who in many cases have been misguided and foolish in the way they've tried to micromanage the war, and their insistence early in the war that Israel reach a ceasefire that would leave Hamas and Hezbollah on their feet, and able to attack again. And we've all become quite cynical about international criticism, not just criticism coming from bodies like UNRWA or UNIFIL, as you mentioned, but including criticism coming from our closest ally in Washington. And all of this, I think, will take years to become completely clear. But Israel post October 7th is not the same country that it was on October 6th.
And the story is still being written. I like to always end the show on a positive note. So I've got to ask you, you've been in Israel now for how many years?
30 years.
What do you love most about living in Israel?
I'm not hesitating because I can't think of anything that I love. I'm hesitating because I like a lot about Israel, and I'm trying to decide on one thing to say. But
Well, I'll tell
I
you what,
guess
Matti, you're going to be back on numerous occasions. So you can just pick one now and then you can share another one the next time. How's that?
I think that what I appreciate most about this country, beyond I love the landscape of the country, and I kind of love the way the people are most of the time. Not all of the people all the time, but I guess most of the people most of the time. But looking at the events that Jews have had to deal with in the diaspora in North
Hmm.
America, in the UK, in France, I'm very grateful to live in a society that has a Jewish majority and has my safety as one of its primary reasons to exist. And it's not that is necessarily effectively exercised at all times, as we saw on October 7th. But certainly, I would much rather be here than to be exposed to the hatred of a majority somewhere else. And I think that's everything that's happened since October 7th, and in general, I think everything that's happened since 1948 has proven the genius of the people who created this country, the genius of people like Theodore Herzl, like David Ben-Gurion, like Golda Meir, the founding generation of the country that really wills this place into being against incredibly long odds, because they understand, as Herzl did in Vienna in the 1890s, that this is not a problem that will be solved by the advance of liberalism in the West, which is what many Jews thought, that Jews need their own place where they can express their own culture and speak their own language and protect themselves. And with everything that's happened, of course, many things that have happened have been awful. I think the logic of their thinking has only been proven, and the scale of their achievement is only demonstrated more and more every day. And I'm grateful to live in, and I'm grateful to live in this country. So, yeah, if I had to really boil it down, I guess that's the way I would put it.
Okay, and you'll share other things that you love about Israel in our future conversations.
The driving, I love the driving.
You love the driving.
Oh yeah, people are
I,
really, really great drivers. They love waiting in line. Everyone here is very polite. The politics are totally sane. It's never too hot. The list is long.
Okay, Mati says tongue in cheek. And on that note, we're going to leave it right there. Listen, it is always so fantastic to have a conversation with you because truly, Mati, you're one of the most insightful people that I know. And I think at this moment that we're living in right now, especially, I wanted to hear from you, and I know our listeners did as well. So we really, really thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the show, and really look forward to having you back before too long and before your next book is out. We look forward to reading it.
It was really a pleasure, and keep up the great work that you're doing and all the great work that JNF is doing on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people.
All right, we're going to certainly try. And indeed, we'll have info about Mati on the show notes page of this very episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And if you're a regular, you know that we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. We may even do some bonus episodes as well. And just so you never miss any episode whenever they're released, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. It's so easy. Simply search for IsraelCast. And don't forget to rate and review us, because that really makes it so much easier for more folks around the world to find us, because it boosts us in the rankings rankings, actually. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And indeed, it takes a homo shop to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, JD Krebs, and Ellie Kadrin. I hope I didn't leave anyone out. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Mirrortone Studios right here in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA and also for that JNF conference in Dallas, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, I know Matti would love to hear from you, and so would I. So do email us at IsraelCast@jnf.org. Once again, IsraelCast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Stephen Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.